Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the Southeastern Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership Winter Meeting. Thank you for being here this morning. I am just going to give a short introduction for our opening session and then turn it over to Dan Berger, who's going to be moderating for us. So from 10 to 12 today, we'll be having a discussion about disaster recovery and resilience in the private sector. We've got 6 different panelists. They'll share some 20-minute slots for presentations. We'll have some Q&A throughout, and then we'll be using Slido for Q&A for you guys to submit questions, and Sean Bath will introduce that in just a few minutes. So I want to turn it over to Dan Berger now, who's going to give you more of an introduction about our speakers.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining us today. According to the SBA, there are over 31 million small businesses in the United States, employing over 60 million individuals, or about 47% of the working population. So chances are that you, a family member, or your neighbor are reflected in these data. And it's virtually guaranteed that your well-being and that of your community depends on the goods and services provided by these small and mid-sized businesses. However, like communities in a general sense, the business community is not immune to climate threats and disasters. And as we're all keenly aware, 2020 was an astonishing year as the nation experienced catastrophic damage wrought by floods, droughts, wildfires, severe storms, and hurricanes. In fact, according to NOAA, there were $22 billion disasters just last year. And in context, this ranks as the 4th highest annual loss, contributing to a dizzying 5-year climate and weather disaster impact of $600 billion. Moreover, many of the climate disasters of 2020 occurred against the backdrop of global pandemic, which is an incomprehensible disaster unto itself, but again, taking its economic toll most heavily on small and mid-sized businesses. As unprecedented as the past year was for weather and climate disasters, it may really only be a harbinger of things to come. And as we're moving forward as professionals and practitioners, we have to remember that long after the disaster headlines fade from the front page news, numerous impacted communities will struggle to regain their footing, make progress on the road to recovery when the next shock or the next disaster occurs. So generally, resilience is defined as a community's ability to prepare for, absorb, recover, and more successfully adapt to future adverse events. And so with that in mind, building resilience among small and mid-sized businesses is really a linchpin in achieving broader community disaster recovery and long-term resilience goals. So our panelists today will provide really valuable insight into the perspectives, the experience, the priorities, and the resilience needs among the small business community. I'm pretty confident that they'll give us a lot to think about. And so to help us think more creatively about how we engage, how we motivate, and mobilize to really confront these insidious threats of climate hazards across the region and across the country. So today's session will be divided into a few segments. In our first segment, we'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Helgeson and Ellie Davis Pierel about their work understanding the small business experience and preparing for and recovering extreme events. We'll have a few minutes after their presentation to have questions and answers. Then we'll turn to Brooks Nelson and Lawrence Bowdish from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, who will put business disaster impacts into a broader context and explain the Chamber's efforts to build resilience capacity at all scales of business across the country. We'll take a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll hear from Carlos Lee and Dr. William Gould about hurricane recovery in Puerto Rico and an innovative effort to convert disaster impact directly into economic recovery efforts. But before I turn it over to our first team of speakers, let's take a few moments to learn more about our audience today. I believe we have a few polling questions available. So if you all don't mind just responding to this quickly so we have a better understanding of who's in the room. Excellent diverse representation today.
Dan, did you want to introduce the next poll?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were walking all the way through it. My mistake. I am hopeful that I am seeing what you're seeing. So we have the one poll of, there we go. So our next question, very curious as to what sector of, frankly, the economy you represent today.
I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, going once, going twice.
Okay, so again, pretty good diversity with the emphasis on the public sector. I would imagine we have a lot of folks who are really interested in opportunities to orient public sector programs around building capacity and accelerating the rate of recovery across the community. So wonderful. We have one more polling question, and this one I'm quite interested in. Given the tendency of us as human beings to compartmentalize, how many disasters have you experienced personally in the last 5 years? And for this one, this can be whether or not this is something that you've responded to in a professional capacity, or that as a citizen and resident of a community have you experienced.
We're going to give it a few more seconds. Votes are still coming in.
Interesting results here. Okay, so the more I think about this might have actually been a bit of a trick question when you consider the number of disasters that have occurred nationally that have had an impact on communities, on economies, whether it's supply chain, whether it's your local grocery store, what have you. But ultimately, the cost of disasters are really borne onto all of us. So when there's one disaster in one community, it does have a ripple effect throughout the country. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that disasters may be most acutely felt locally, but they do have national implications. So keep that in mind as we start moving towards our panel discussions here today. I believe Sean is going to orient you all to the Slido application that will enable you to submit questions for our panelists and elevate them so that we can make efficient use of everyone's time today. Sean?
Good morning, everyone. I'll be brief so that we can move on to the first set of panelists. Today, we're going to be using slido.com for Q&A. You can access slido.com by putting it into your browser, putting it into your mobile browser, or even using this QR code while it is up on the screen. I also put the information into the chat with the code. You'll input the code when you're at the website, and you will be able to submit questions and upvote questions that are already there. So you'll only see this screen during our Q&A phases after each participant speaks and during the panel, but you can always see the chat for the code. Okay, that's it.
Terrific, Sean, thank you. I'd now like to turn it over to our first team of speakers, Dr. Jennifer Helgeson from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and Ellie Davis Pierel from the University of South Carolina. Take it away.
All right, so hopefully everyone can hear me. Good morning or other time in the day, wherever you may be viewing from. So Ellie and I will be tag teaming to talk a little bit about the impacts that we've been studying over the last almost year now, thinking about complex events and how they are impacting small and medium-sized enterprises. Next slide, please. All right, so when we say something like complex events, what do we actually mean? So there's increasing discussion, a very good paper referenced here that talks a little bit about impact types, right? So compound risk, interacting risk, interconnected, and cascading impacts are all quite important in terms of what we're looking at in our research. First and foremost, we're really trying to find the nexus of those who experience natural hazards as disasters during the last year plus within the context of the pandemic. And, you know, that's a compound risk, but there's also a number of cascading impacts. And in thinking about that, kind of thought of this idea of just complex impacts overall. So Dan gave some really good and slightly sad and troubling statistics, but small and medium-sized enterprises in areas that are vulnerable to extreme weather and climate really do face added concerns as they prepare for recovery and future resilience. So there is some burgeoning literature about kind of the liability of smallness, liability of newness. We think about whether this might be an asset in some sectors and for some who have prepared in different ways. So just, you know, this idea that there's a lot going on. It's hard to make decisions if you're an owner or manager of a small and medium-sized enterprise. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so there's a number of pieces to this research, so we will quickly give an introduction and move forth swiftly to some of the results. But in 2019, the NIST Applied Economics Office and the NOAA Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Network teamed up. That's why I know Ellie in this work that we did in Charleston and another couple of very specific locations. But the idea being that at the national level, my office has expertise in thinking about small, medium-sized enterprises and doing some of this survey work. Back at that time, it was all on foot, you know, going around and talking to people in person. And in dealing with CISA, it was just such a pleasure in terms of having local experts and kind of putting our heads together, specifically at that time, thinking about Charleston, South Carolina. So next slide, please. All right, so what has happened since then? When the pandemic struck and it looked like things would maybe last, you know, a few months, not as long as they have at the moment, NIST really kind of wanted to do more of a national level online survey. So what we were seeking to look at, leveraging some of our early results in Charleston and other places, was to understand kind of what actions are employed during COVID-19, you know, overall, kind of understand the challenges in implementing resilience-based actions identify past strategies, specifically past strategies that focus on natural disasters and how they've been adapted to the current situation. And to think about forward looking, right? As plans are made, I think for many, many years, people will want to prepare as if there could be a pandemic that coincides with these other events. Next slide, please, John.
So also following up from our 2019 study, I took over the Carolinas side of the survey and conducted an in-depth online survey of 60 plus questions in the Carolinas. So specifically targeting the coastal counties in the Carolinas who have been overwhelmingly and repeatedly impacted by hurricanes and also daily flooding, and then now COVID. And from that, we had 199 respondents. And then we had the opportunity to work with a company called Alignable, which is a online networking platform for small businesses. And they have been conducting baseline surveys throughout the pandemic, and also these color surveys, as you might call them. They're much shorter, only about 15 questions, and we were able to then ask some very targeted questions along our objectives for a much larger audience. Next slide. And the survey themes for these two projects were in line with a lot of the work that Jennifer has been doing. And the first objective was also to assess complex hazard preparation and then COVID-19 response. The second being this social network idea that businesses that are receiving support are also then providing that support to the community, and community integration might be a component of resilience. The third objective is understanding the existing attitudes and social norms and the amount of control that small business owners feel like they have, and how that might impact their decisions to adapt or not adapt depending on their situation. And the fourth objective is then to look at the future of natural hazard response and how COVID-19 might have some lessons learned, but also could decrease resilience in the long term. Next slide. And next slide.
Okay, so quickly some initial results from the NIST NOAA National Survey. So kind of weighted by census regions, we took the 4 high-level census regions. As one would expect, many of those that took the survey have been affected by natural hazards in the past. The percentages are here. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an interesting piece where we look at those that were affected by a natural disaster during COVID-19. So it's a larger pie there. And of those affected, kind of whether or not the response was impacted by having this happen during a pandemic. So it really was pretty evenly split. Kind of in more detailed analysis, this typically does trend kind of with the type of event. And I'm happy to discuss this more kind of during the question and answer session. Next slide.
And then what we looked at is from the what are the impacts to what are the impacts of small businesses, and we looked at that for asking small businesses who provided support to them, and also what type of support was that. And overwhelmingly, the support that they received was from the federal government in the form of PPP and other loans and financial support, and then also in the type of support. But there's also this large chunk that was something that we had hypothesized, but not known really what it looked like, which is this business-to-business support. And that comes in many different forms: in-kind, PPE, sharing resources, giving each other discounts, or postponing payment. There are a lot of different ways that businesses are then connected to each other and supporting each other. Next slide. And then what we found was 64% of businesses both received and provided some sort of support within the pandemic. So they received maybe financial support from the federal government, but then were able to distribute support in many different capacities within their community. And also 32% of the businesses did not receive any type of support, but still were able to provide some sort of support within their community. And they were giving that to local charities and nonprofits, their friends and family. Lots of people wrote comments in that said, my neighbors, I was helping my neighbors. Even their customers by postponing payments or doing different discounts, and also supporting local businesses as well as their employees. So they're taking that one major source of support and distributing it quite widely throughout the community. Next slide.
Next slide. Yeah, so what does the future hold? And really, you know, this work I should have mentioned at NIST took place kind of during the latter part of the summer. So there had just been a number of hurricanes, quite a lot going on. And we found, and again, there's a lot more behind kind of the numbers I'm showing here by region, the concerns about kind of these complex events from natural disasters during the COVID were really rather substantial. And they trended across those that had already experienced a natural disaster during the pandemic and those who had not. So it was important to us that people were really thinking about that. Next slide. All right, so working left to right, within kind of this national level NIST NOAA survey, 29% of those who responded have experienced a natural disaster during the pandemic. So we expect that, you know, they opted in to do this survey. But then 66% actually kind of implemented natural disaster resilience in the past, you know, pre-COVID, of whom 23% actually note kind of the use of resilience measures to address COVID-19, which I thought was quite notable. And 72% are concerned about future complex events in the context of COVID-19. So that could be all kinds of things, right? Supply chain issues, other issues that small, medium-sized businesses face, health issues, issues with their family. But of that larger 72, 31% kind of identify their concern as arising specifically from natural disasters during the pandemic. So next slide.
And then we took this question of concern and we broke it down into multiple categories. So from very concerned to very unconcerned. And then we also asked them about these actions that they had taken, whether they were planning on taking action, whether they'd already done that, whether they were absolutely not going to do anything. And then this category that we're calling action paralyzed. And those are the people who feel like there's nothing that they can do. There's no point to doing anything. And so it's not just saying I'm not going to do anything, but really I don't feel like I can do anything. And we did this for multiple different categories. These are COVID-19 and natural hazards, but it is interesting seeing that large paralyzed section in both of those categories. Next slide. And I just wanted to pull up natural hazards because that is what we're talking about at this conference. And just thinking about who is that group and where is that group that feels like there's nothing that they can do to prevent or help themselves when there is a natural hazard that occurs. And how can we support them more thoroughly? Next slide. And just pulling that out a little bit more. So this is the map of percent of businesses in each state who feel that way in terms of respondents. And some of the potential factors that seem to be correlated, or at least somewhat related with that answer, is their amount of involvement in the community. So their involvement seems to be quite a bit lower, whether that is because they're just not receiving support, and they're also not giving support. So that's something that is a potential factor, as well as they're often younger businesses, and they're also often smaller businesses that feel like there's just nothing that they can do to prevent those impacts. Next slide. And then also working from left to right for future natural hazards. As well, in our survey, they said that their past experiences with natural hazards had helped about 20%. So that's consistent with Jennifer's national survey as well. Nice to see some consistency in surveys. Then 43% of the respondents said that they believed that what they had learned during COVID would be applicable and helpful for natural hazard response in the future. And unfortunately, 22% of the respondents said that they felt like their ability to respond to a natural hazard in the future has been decreased by COVID. And that's in many different capacities. They're using personal savings to pay for COVID damages, and that is decreasing their ability to then pay in the future for natural hazards damages. There are many different ways that both of these numbers could play out over the future as we're experiencing more hazards, especially as we're going into hurricane season again. Next slide.
Okay, so some expressed needs, kind of specific to the idea of thinking about natural disasters during COVID-19 and in future pandemics. So really, small, medium-sized enterprises really were seeking assistance in navigating what they were thinking about is deep uncertainty. Will it be a month? Will it be 12 months? As Eleanor just noted, how far should I dip into my savings? Because I just don't know when this will end. Secondly, clear and detailed information and training. This is really some of the basics. Many owners had no online footprint before this happened, and just really were not as literate in how to make that work and how to do it in a financially savvy way. Assistance with PPE and other equipment, not necessarily just obtaining it, but actually understanding what's required in their sector and getting useful and streamlined information. Then access to financial assistance and financial information. Again, not always just to get the money, so to speak, but to understand what the choice sets are and the implications of the choices being made. Next slide. All right, so just very quickly here, I think throughout, looking at all of these survey efforts, we spoke a lot about this idea of kind of being paralyzed and thinking there's not much that can be done. So I think we have quite a few people from the public sector on today. I'd just like to quickly highlight this idea of kind of having the freedom to select and to feel like they have that freedom, what we've called kind of agency here, flexibility, the actual ability to adjust, and then learning and enhanced reasoning over time. I think if there is some movement in these spaces, it really can strengthen the ability to address natural hazards going forward, especially when you have less resources because you're coming off the heels of a pandemic. Just some things to keep in mind. Next slide.
And just some takeaways from this presentation, and as we continue to work on this research, as Jennifer just said, flexibility is a key step, and we saw this quantitatively, but also qualitatively as people wrote in the comments, and they said that being able to adjust quickly, being flexible as a business has helped them for both natural hazards as well as then for the pandemic. Then community involvement can be very critical for small business survival, and both going both directions for receiving support, but also providing support and supporting the community. Then for this group that feels action paralyzed, there really needs to be some targeted assistance for those groups, and being able to identify them, get them the support that they need, make them feel like they're part of a community where they have agency. And then future planning, we've always, the community has always hypothesized that this is the case, but now we're actually able to study it, the importance of multi-hazard planning and for actions and responses. So not just focusing specifically on a hurricane plan, but making it more of a business disruption, wider plan. And then finally, we keep seeing this, that owners are dipping into their personal savings to be able to support their employees and support their communities. And while that is an admirable quality for the community participation side, it could in the future cause some issues down the road. Next slide, please.
Yeah. So I will mention that kind of the NIST NOAA National Survey is a longitudinal effort, and we have a second wave kind of refreshment sample open. So yeah, please encourage your networks if and as appropriate to participate. The next slide. Next slide. All right, so please get in touch if you have any questions. And I realize we don't have our emails there, but they're easy. You can Google us.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for your presentation. So we've had some questions come in. And I believe Jennifer and Ellie, you're able to see these as well. So we can just take them in order if you'd like. We are running a little bit behind, so we'll keep it to these two questions, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. So question one, is there any organization or partnership that fosters a network of regional small businesses to assist each other during these challenging times?
Go ahead.
So there are a number of different organizations, and I think that we'll also be hearing from Lawrence and the Chamber of Commerce, Brooks as well, about some of the resources that they have. But we did work with Alignable, which is one example of a networking organization where where you're linked within 5 miles for other small businesses that are on there. But there are also state organizations, local chambers of commerce. There are a lot of different groups that are working on this.
Many times very informal networks that we've heard about in passing, that might be through a place of worship, for example.
Or a community Facebook group.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different. Yeah.
I can speak briefly, Dan, maybe to the second question, if useful. So I think, SBA, actually I've been looking through their resources, and they do offer a lot of resources that aren't just about the finances. So I think, I don't want to completely discount kind of government assistance at that high level and kind of what is provided online. So thinking about these online resources or websites, it seemed like sector specific, especially manufacturing, there are a lot of online resources and a lot, we didn't talk about it in this presentation, but a lot of trusted information were coming from what you'd say industry news. So I would encourage kind of thinking about that. I don't know if there's other things that you guys would like to add. We can continue the discussion kind of at the end as well.
Indeed, and I believe our next presenters, Brooks Nelson and Lawrence Bowdish from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, are going to speak to some of the toolkits that are available. So without further delay, we'll turn it over to you, gentlemen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dan. You can go to the next slide. So as Dan mentioned, I am Brooks Nelson, and I lead our Community Resilience and Disaster Response Program at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with the Chamber, we support all businesses, from small businesses and local chambers to large associations and large corporations. So I think a lot of people, when they think of the chamber, probably think more big business, but we realize that small businesses are the backbones of the local communities. And so that is why this is such a big priority for us, including the foundation's work. I think, businesses are only as strong as the communities they operate in, the employees they hire, as well as their supply chain, which is what we will get into in this presentation. I think, Dan already gave us some great information, as did our previous presenters, on some of the statistics of small businesses, but globally, SMEs account for 90% of businesses, and so their survival is our priority. Next slide. And as also mentioned, we are only seeing disasters increasing, and so thinking about climate adaptation as a priority moving forward is definitely the stance that the chamber takes. I think in previous years, investments in resiliency was somewhat of a luxury for communities, but now it's an imperative and something that we all need to get on board and do our part, especially when it comes to the private sector. Next slide. So as was mentioned, Chambers created several tools, and I think the information that Jennifer and Ellie just shared was fantastic, especially giving you an overview of the need within the small business community. The U.S. Chamber has done some research, and only 35% of businesses have taken any steps to prepare for a natural disaster or business interruption. So that leaves 65% of small businesses completely unprepared. We see that because of a lack of resources, lack of time, and as Ellie and Jennifer talked about, really just not knowing what steps they can take and what to do. So I'm going to spend the next couple minutes talking about some of the resources that we've created and that we provide in partnership with the UPS Foundation. And then Lawrence is going to talk a little bit more about some of the community impacts that we've seen through his research. So one of the main resources and tools that we provide is called Resilience in a Box. As mentioned, these businesses don't have the time or resources, and so we wanted to develop a tool that would make it easy for them to think about adapting resiliency practices within their own businesses and where to start. It was created through business continuity experts who have years of experience and tried to boil it down and make it very easy. We do have it created with a beginner, intermediate, and then introductory to advanced levels, including our top 20 tips for businesses, things businesses can do now, a business preparedness checklist, as well as our 101 workbook. Next slide. So this is an overview of the checklist, and I should mention all of these resources are available on our website at uschamberfoundation.org, Resilience in a Box. They are charged. We, as the nonprofit arm of the chamber, create these tools to strengthen the communities and strengthen the businesses. And so we want to remove any entry barrier for those businesses and provide this information to them. This checklist is part of the beginner package, and it is something that we share with businesses throughout the year and hope that they will adapt and adopt to their own business. But it's also something that we send out 48 hours in advance of a disaster, because there are steps that these businesses can take once a disaster is on the horizon. Making sure that they know how to get in contact with their employees, make sure that they fortified their business. Small steps that they can take and go through this checklist quickly to make sure that they are prepared and more resilient. Next slide. Additionally, as I mentioned, we have the top 20 tips. Again, this is something that we hope these business owners will take to their team and utilize and think about how to make their business more resilient. We strongly encourage that this not just be on the shoulders of the business owner, but really building a team within the business or encouraging their employees to be a part of this process with making your small business more resilient, because we feel that the more introduction that they have at their business, the more resilient these employees will take back to home to their families as well. Next slide. So I'm going to just give you kind of a very brief overview of what the workbook covers, because I think a lot of what we want to talk about is the community impact and the research that Lawrence has did. But the workbook is part of the intermediate package, where a business can actually go through an editable PDF and start to assess their risk based on 6 critical business areas, which you see here on the slide, including operations, inventory, equipment, buildings, people, and data. And then looking at their risk level associated with each of those critical areas, as well as the all hazards approach that they may include. So you have your negligible, marginal, critical, and catastrophic risk. As I mentioned, we did create this tool in mind with all hazards. So whether you are in Tornado Alley or facing hurricanes or earthquakes, even a pandemic, these steps that the workbook lays out can help you align your continuity plan and program regardless of the disaster. So as I mentioned, all of these tools are available on our website. We do make them free of charge. We also do trainings with local chambers to support them and these businesses. In response to the question earlier about the network, we do definitely promote that as well. We have several LinkedIn groups to connect small businesses and share their lessons learned and their experiences, and definitely encourage that at the local chamber as well. So I will now pass it over to Lawrence to talk a little bit about the research, and then we can come back to questions about the tool.
Thanks, Brooks. You can go to the next slide. So as Brooks mentioned, my name is Lawrence Bowdish, and as I was introduced, I am a historian who plays an economist on TV. And so because of that, I need to warn you that you've had about 25 minutes of really interesting, insightful stuff. Now you're going to be bored for 10 minutes. I had to cut out all my jokes, but we'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. Happy to take any questions as we get to the end. So when we started this process, one of the things that almost everyone in this room has seen is the stat that is cited according to FEMA, that 40% of small businesses don't open after a disaster. And it's challenging to find out where that appeared, but I actually talked to someone who was at the meeting when that occurred. And this is how you see it lined out, that you'll see 40% of small businesses won't reopen immediately after disaster, 25% more will close after a year, 75% of businesses without a continuity plan will fail. Well, this was based on a single meeting that FEMA had held after some Nevada wildfires about 20 years ago. And so, I'm sorry, next slide. I just tried to advance the slide myself. So what you actually end up seeing, there was an analysis of post-disaster Katrina, and the author there, side at the bottom, surveyed almost 500 small businesses. 8 years later, 75% of them were still open with the same owner. So that is quite high. And so we're trying to figure out where the truth between them is, which makes it important to figure out where to focus our efforts. Next slide, please. Because when you talk to some small businesses about preparing for a disaster, occasionally they think about it like this. So this is year-over-year changes and inflows for small businesses from JPMorgan Chase Institute after Harvey and Irma. And if you look at this, you can see that except for July 4th occurring on different weeks, it's all very flat until you get to the actual Harvey and Irma impacts in 2017. And this is, I'm sorry, these are for businesses in the places where they were hit. So this is Texas and Florida. And what you found is that they had massive decreases in those inflows, but recovered within 3 weeks. And so you have to be, sometimes we have to make sure that when you go to small businesses and they see this, they think, oh, we only have to cover 3 weeks of inflows, when that's not quite the case for reasons we'll get to. Next slide. So it's early, so my southern accent isn't that thick, but I am from Panama City, Florida, and this is a pizza restaurant in Panama City, Florida, ran by my sister-in-law, her sister and her mother. This is Panorama Pizza. And for those of you unfamiliar with Panama City, it made news for being both the location for spring break for 50 years and where Hurricane Michael hit 2 years ago. Next slide. And so what happened with Panorama Pizza is what you'd expect would happen to any small business during a hurricane and major disaster. Hurricane Michael was a Cat 5 when it hit about 3 miles east of where the restaurant is. And so there are certainly things that small businesses like Panorama can do to prepare for a disaster. I've listed them out here. Think about the things that small businesses can get ready for and get insurance against. But if you look at the next slide, well, you find there are a lot of things that individual businesses can't prepare for. So there's lifeline utility disruptions. Panorama was without power for 7 weeks. There's a loss of customer base and sales. A lot of people just kind of up and leave when disaster is bad. A loss of employees, same reason. We'll get to that in a moment. But the thing that kind of made Panorama's recovery the most difficult was the loss of key suppliers. They were, I would even say, overinsured. They were made whole by anything that happened to the structure. The pizza place can run with fewer people. My brother, who has another job, was volunteering, essentially washing dishes at night. But what stopped them was something like what you see here in this picture. So for those of you that have been in the restaurant industry, their cooler had flooded. They couldn't use it. They needed to get a new, freezer. They needed to get a new freezer. So the closest place that would sell them a freezer they could get delivered was in New Jersey. And so they call and get the freezer from the restaurant supply store. The freezer shows up and this is it. Well, if you weren't from a restaurant, you might realize what's in that picture is not a freezer. So they'd ordered a freezer and a refrigerator shows up 3 weeks later. So then they had to drive to Jacksonville to get a freezer. They can't open without one. Everything else is ready. And so these are the things that small businesses have to deal with, that it can be difficult when utility disruptions, lifeline disruptions, and suppliers are impacted. Next slide. And this is something that when we think about the small business community, we want to think about them in toto. And I want to compare a little bit dealing with small business resilience during recessions, which we are deep in the middle of at this point, versus a disaster. And what I've put here is the growth of small businesses from past 20 years, 1998 to 2018. And the blue are for, and I'm sorry, when I speak about businesses from this point forward, I'm talking about employers. So there are just under 7 million employers in the United States. So these do not include self-employed or Uber drivers, anything like that. And the number of small businesses in 2007, and the colors here, blue is less than 5 employees, yellow is 5 to 9, gray is 10 to 19. There were 6.6 million right before the recession hit. And it took a decade for the number of small businesses to return to what it was in 2007. And that's the context I want to think about. Next slide. And this is when you look at the percentage of growth. And so this is essentially what you just saw on the last slide, looking at percentage changes with the same groups. So you see massive decreases after 07 that don't even become positive until 2011 when it starts recovering. So to contextualize a little bit, one of the things that we did was looked at business growth as the number of small businesses and places where 3 different disasters hit. So we looked at Sandy, the Joplin tornado, and Katrina, and tracked the number of small businesses in I believe it's 12 disaster declared counties between those 3 disasters. And so if you can go to the next slide. So we put all of disasters in a single year. We sort of sorted the data sets to where all those disasters happened at the same year and tracked the actual number of small businesses the difference in number of small businesses. So this is not tracking individuals, it's tracking whole counts of businesses in those counties. And as you can see here, most business numbers drop pretty precipitously after disaster, except for very small businesses. So in all of them, there is an uptick in 1 to 4 employee business growth. The reasons for that are somewhat obvious. A lot of times, mid-sized businesses become very small businesses after disaster. A lot of times people lose their jobs and start small businesses. And so one of the things that we came up with, which is kind of important, is when you talk about resilience and recovery immediately after disasters, you're going to have a lot of new businesses coming up, new very small micro businesses coming up that have never perhaps been in the business world before. And so when we talked about our resilience in a box and other issues, we really focus on chambers and other networks to get it to these new businesses that arise out of like a phoenix out of the ashes of the disaster. Next slide. And what I did was compare the difference between the 12 county disasters, the impacts that they had on the disaster versus the entire country's impact on the recession. And this is just a retelling of the last two slides. So this is the, again, total number percent per county, how many companies ebb and flow. And as you can see here, except for these very micro businesses, disasters have a much worse impact than the recession, but on an overall business community, it's actually quite similar. The real difference is, if you go to the next slide, is the change in the labor force. And so those two things I mentioned is things that companies can't get ready for, and that's a loss of customers and a loss of employees. Disasters, since they tend not to happen everywhere at the same time, we'll get to COVID in a second, have usually suffer a massive decrease in the labor force, because people who have marketable skills will go somewhere else to market them if their community is destroyed. Whereas in a recession, there's really nowhere to go. Labor force departures in the recession are mainly from people being pushed out of labor force, not leaving the geographic community. And so making sure that we not only make sure that individual businesses are resilient, but that communities are resilient. That way, the people that need to employ and patronize those businesses don't roll out after something occurs. And so that also has made us think a little bit differently about our resiliency issues. Next slide, please. So I've been talking about whole communities for a minute. Now I want to talk about individual business birth and death rates. Next slide. So on average, about 10 to 11% of businesses fail every year, regardless of what happens in their local community. And what you see here is that's much higher for the 1 to 4 employee count. The black line are all businesses, and then the 5 to 9 and the 10 to 19, as we've been discussing. If you can get to 5 to 9 employees, you have a really good chance of not closing any given year. And so this gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Next slide. And since 1977, this is tracked by MSA, not by county, about 10% of business companies close every year. The worst city to start a company in the past 40 years is Bend, Oregon. They've had the worst closure rates over the past 40 years. Unfortunately, there is a statistical error of some of the data for Pacific Northwest for the business dynamics statistics, so don't quite trust that number, although they are working on it and they'll fix it for the next output. And if you want to start a company, go to Sheboygan, because no one's closing in Sheboygan. And what I did is, if you go to the next slide, look at these counties, again, that had these impacts, and look at how many businesses closed in that MSA. So this looks at every single business that was in that count from the year before, how many of them individually exited existence. So they didn't become smaller or bigger. They're no longer in the count at all. And the highest on record are New Orleans and Gulfport from 2005. 21.6% of businesses ceased to exist. After that, they didn't get smaller, didn't get bigger, they ceased to exist. And those were the biggest at the time. Pascagoula, another MSA hit, also quite high at 14.5. But when you looked at other disasters, Sandy and Andrew, for instance, New York, the MSA that encapsulated the 5 counties that were declared disaster in 2012, 47th out of 357 MSAs. So not very high because of Sandy. And Andrew upticked a little higher, but was not the worst. Cape Coral, Fort Myers actually had a bigger impact from Andrew than Miami did on permanent business closures. And so this leans a little bit to the fact that some cities, obviously some disasters are stronger, more impactful than others, but some cities tend to be more resilient than others. Some of that might have to do with the size of the city, other industries. But again, thinking about resilience for communities becomes particularly important. Next slide. And so this means that by the time we recover from COVID, we should expect an impact on business nationally about the same as New Orleans after Katrina. The National Bureau of Economic Research, I forgot the R for a second, folks have been tracking this, kind of expect a 20 to 25% permanent closure rate for small businesses after COVID, which is exactly the same as New Orleans. So I want you to think about New Orleans businesses in 2005, and that's essentially what economists think are going to occur in the long term nationally for business impact. But again, some communities are more resilient than others. And I think what we learn from communities that come out of COVID based on actions they took, actions they didn't take, policies they put in place, things they did to help the business community, we're going to know a lot in the next 3 to 6 months about how these efforts are impactful. Next slide. And remember, I said something about the labor force. So the issue with that is labor force participation is declined for the past 20 years. And so this is the percent of adults who are in the labor force. And if you look at what happened in COVID, it was a precipitous drop. Now, this is different than what happens in disasters. But if we don't get most of these people back to work, if we don't climb back up to 63% down from 60, then there's a lot of folks out of work who are obviously not working at these businesses and can't be very good consumers to patronize them. Next slide. Uh-oh. Next. So again, just to reiterate what Brooks has already said, we want to develop small business tools. Small businesses are the lifeblood of every community. They employ 85, 90, 95% of people in these communities based on which one you're talking about. But we want to make sure that their communities and the business ecosystems are strong as well. We can't focus on the micro impacts of individual businesses, although that's very important in the bedrock of it. If we do that out of context, we won't have the community support to back it up. And then those are that. And the last slide is just our contact information. Happy to take questions.
Gentlemen, thanks so much. So thank you for the crowdsourced questions here. So we'll take them as they come. We have about 5 minutes here. So do any of the demographic or geographic information as it relates to small business failures or successes? Do you have that information in a granular form?
So kind of, unfortunately, when you look at the individual birth and death rates are only tracked by MSA. And so unfortunately, the rural urban divide isn't that helpful. When it comes to states, generally high death rates are associated with high birth rates. And so for some, like Florida, the churn is very high. Like death rates tend to be a bit higher because birth rates are a bit higher. And I think based on your feeling about the business community, one could be, either you want heavy churn, so survive or survive, or you want low churn like Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where it's just the same businesses forever. And there's pros and cons to both, but the Carolinas tend to be in the middle, if I remember this correctly, or at least the MSAs within the Carolinas, excuse me. And then Florida's tend to be kind of high just because the churn is very high.
Great. I'm going to direct this next question over to Brooks. So what has been the biggest request in terms of small business assistance that you're aware of in the era of COVID? Where are you seeing most interest in participating in assistance programs?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I think my video may have frozen. So I think right now we're hearing a lot about the vaccine rollout and how businesses should be handling that. Throughout COVID, it was obviously the reopening and the different restrictions that different communities had, how they manage questions for employees, how they engage with customer base. So we put together a number of kind of resource guides, posters, communication toolkits for those small businesses to be able to communicate with their employees and their customers. And I mean, I know it says other than funding, but really funding has been the dominant issue and request from small businesses, especially those that were not eligible for PPP loans. I think there's been a lot of challenges within the SBA program, just nuances where businesses were either too new or didn't have the right documentation, or just little hiccups where they may have been eligible, but the challenges within the system definitely there as well.
Great. And if you have time, or if we all have time, because we're at 11 o'clock, but quickly, does your organization have data to help explain the steady decline in the available labor force?
So I appreciate this question. It is probably this is kind of like the P equals NP unsolvable problem of economics right now, because no one really knows. This labor force participation rate, when you look at it, actually includes unemployed. It includes everyone who said, if I gave you, anyone you went to said, here's a full-time job, will you take it? They are in the labor force. So the long-term declension of it, about 1/3 of it is related to earlier retirements. So it caps out at 65. And so some of it has to do with fewer people working in their earlier 60s. But other than that, there's very little, there's not much to tell. I mean, long-term structural automation might do it, but short-term won't. So it's a mystery that a lot of folks are working on.
All right, excellent. Well, we are just running about 2 minutes behind, but that's all right. We're now going to take about a 5-minute break, or I'm sorry, a 10-minute break, during which time Amanda's going to queue up a great video for us to look. So we'll see you back here in about 8 minutes. Let's try to regroup at 10 after 11. Thank you.
This is Sean. I'll try to queue it up over here. Actually, Barbara, are you able to start it up?
Yeah, I can. You have to make me presenter again.
Okay.
Hold on.
Barbara, there's a message to click for audio. Would you mind clicking that to see if we can hear it as well?
The fucking
Hey, good morning, Bill. How are you?
Good. Can you
Good.
hear me?
Well, I can just fine.
That's good.
Carlos, are you available?
Yes, I am.
Okay, very good. We'll give folks another couple of minutes before we reconvene.
Okay.
Sure. Dana, I just put some headphones and microphone on. I just want to do a comm check. Are you hearing me as well? No?
Loud and clear. Thank you, Carlos.
All right. Bill, good morning. Can you hear me well?
Yep.
My goodness, that's a different uniform you were you're using today.
Got the tie on.
Yeah. Right. Let me see. Share my webcam. There we go.
Interesting talks.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, everybody, thank you all for reconvening on time. We're going to go ahead and get started and turn it over to our next team of presenters. Next up, we have Bill Gould from the Caribbean Climate Hub and Carlos Lee, a business collaborator. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you about some of our experiences after the 2017 hurricanes. And thanks to the earlier presenters, out of my field, but super interesting to think of that perspective in terms of kind of the story that we lived through in Puerto Rico and what we'd like to present. Could I have the next slide, please? So Carlos and I are going to team up. I would like to present a little bit about the effects of the 2017 hurricanes on trees and forests, and then talk about a timeline we experienced in our efforts to salvage some of the timber from these hurricanes. And then Carlos is going to give some perspective, some of his perspective on that process and on the lessons learned, challenges, and some of the opportunities that we recognize. Next slide. So 2017, we had within a 2-week period, we had a Category 5 and a Category 4 hurricane that passed over Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands. Some of the main immediate effects were complete loss of power, complete loss of communication, sometimes for weeks or months, depending on where you were. Closed roads, limited fuel. From a natural resource perspective, we had nearly complete defoliation of the forest cover, lots of downed trees, and big impacts on our agricultural sector. Next slide, please. And thinking about those disasters in the perspective of trends and climate change, projections are that there's more heat, there's more intensity to storms in the atmosphere, and so we'll see more high impact events like that. And a couple of graphics from the NOAA site that tracks these costly disasters. They're getting more detail, more ways to look at this information that are great. The upper left shows the cost per event over a 40-year period. And you can see a high cost to those in the Caribbean and some of the southeastern states. And then in the lower right, the graphic shows the increasing costs of these events, different kinds of climate disasters over the same 40-year period for the Southeast. And that's reflected throughout the US. Next slide, please. So at our climate hub, the 27 hurricanes had a big impact on our activities. We got involved in hurricane assessments, involved in the issue of salvaging downed trees. thinking about strategic reforestation in terms of climate change and hurricanes, and also developing tools for our stakeholders. Next slide, please. The hurricane assessment work had a couple of different aspects. One was just looking at the physical effects that we could document in terms of particularly wind and rain, and trying to quantify those. We had some modeling efforts to take advantage of what we learned about the wind energy that passed over the island, and that takes into account the speed of the hurricane, the wind speeds, the topography, and the time of travel, and thinking about future storms. If we had bigger storms with more energy, more wind, what would the effects be on the landscape? Next slide, please. We also had some efforts gathering information from advisors to agriculture and forestry, and also to farmers and forest managers and ranchers, to get some sense of what they experienced, what was most vulnerable, least vulnerable in terms of their scope of work, and see what we could learn from those efforts. A couple examples here of a survey of 9 different institutions across Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands, getting the perception of advisors from the folks they work with as to what were the greatest impacts, what kinds of strategies do they have for preparedness and recovery, and how prevalent are the application of those strategies. Next slide, please. Just an example of some of the kinds of information from that particular survey. The advisors were perceiving or getting information from the folks they worked with as to the most critical impacts, and those include power outages, communication issues, and fallen trees fell out as the 3rd most important impact. And the colors there indicate over 75% of the advisors calculated these as having high or devastating impact on the folks they work with. And this similar finding was replicated by a survey of USDA advisors throughout the Southeast and Caribbean, and you saw the same sort of prioritization with fallen trees having a big impact. Okay, next slide, please. So our experience after the passing of Hurricane Maria, there was the recovery efforts crank into gear. There's a lot of experience with FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers and others to respond to these kind of disasters. And as part of that process, they're going about cleaning up vegetative debris. And we had 4 or 5 million cubic yards of vegetative material just in the right-of-ways. And so contracts are in place, people get to work clearing that debris. And shortly after the hurricane, there was a recognition among some folks that the plan was to gather that debris, burn it, or put it in landfills. And there was a recognition that, well, wait a minute, we've got 500 different tree species growing in Puerto Rico, lots of beautiful tropical hardwoods, and maybe there's something better to do with that than burn it or chip it up. So we organized a number of workshops with both private landowners and private businesses and different government agencies to discuss this topic. Next slide, please. And some of the early outcomes of those discussions were that we had more than, there's a typo here, more than 30 million trees damaged and downed just in Puerto Rico. The initial plan really was to consider all of this as waste, incinerate it or put it in landfills. And there's a recognition that this is probably not the best use of that kind of a resource, and that wood has value as compost, biochar, wood chips, artisanal uses, and low to high value milled timber. But there's a necessity to process this material in a way so that you can get it from a debris pile into some sort of a marketable product of value. And also out of these meetings, a number of action items were identified for different federal government agencies to get together, discuss, figure out options. Also a big need to begin some education efforts as to what the value of this might be in this debris pile and what we could do with it. And there were a number of follow-up action plans developed with federal, state, university, NGOs, and private partners. And all of these efforts were ongoing with concurrent contracts and debris clearing efforts of FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers. Their mission is to save lives and save property. And so a key part of this is to make sure that the roadways are clear. And so that was their mission. A follow-up, there were a lot of difficulties in this process, and I'll mention those, but a year and a half later, well, let me clarify. One major follow-up was that there was an executive order to pull out logs over a certain size out of that waste stream and set those aside. So for a year, this was in place, and a number of valuable timber logs were set aside and put in separate debris piles. But that's where things stopped. That's where things kind of ran into some bottlenecks. And as a follow-up, a year and a half later, most of that debris, even the logs that were set aside, had been chipped and put in landfills. But at that time, there were still a few remaining piles we surveyed, and there were about 45,000 cubic yards of logs that remained. And my estimate is that was about 1% of what was available in those salvage piles just from the right-of-way debris. Okay, next slide. So some of the efforts that that came out of these meetings were these efforts at educating folks as to what's in these debris piles. And some of that was tied to the executive order so that we could educate folks working with the debris. This is what to keep an eye out for in terms of types of logs to pull out and set aside. There was education efforts to private landowners who also had a lot of downed trees on their property. You know, some sort of flow charts, what to do if you are in this situation, who do you talk to, what can you do with this material? And then some education efforts and training to think about how you transform something that's in a debris pile to a product of value. And there's expertise needed in all the steps, from chainsawing, moving material, to milling, to developing wood products. So we worked on that part of this problem. Next slide, please. In terms of the efforts of working with the disaster response agencies and trying to develop plans and get support to salvage this timber, there was some successes and some failures. We were able to develop a mission with FEMA that was very well defined in terms of steps of how to go from a debris pile to a well-inventoried stockpile that then could be moved to a market where you could identify what you have and find uses for it. However, that mission only lasted 3 months due to some obstacles within the process between agencies. And even though it was a great start, we never were able to use any of the support from that mission because it was not continued. That was one of many proposals that outline steps to take to deal with this huge amount of potentially valuable material. Some of the obstacles in making any of these successful was that we were developing these plans after the fact. The material was on the ground and the recovery agencies were in the process of clearing streets and doing what they needed to do with that material. There were lots of loopholes or bottlenecks in terms of support from the recovery agencies. And part of that is because there's lots of stovepipes in terms of how agencies respond to recoveries. And we were trying to create some sort of knowledge that was shared across these agencies and have them take actions that hadn't been in their plans before. So there were a lot of difficulties there. Additionally, and I think Carlos may talk about this, the lack of capacity for a timber industry in Puerto Rico, lack of processing equipment capacity, log handling, things like that. Okay, next slide. So we did take advantage to learn what we could from the resources that we could establish for this in terms of pilot projects and figuring out how do you move valuable timber from debris pile after a storm into valuable products and recover some of that value. And what's the expertise needed? What are the steps needed? What are the kinds of resources needed to actually recover that value? Next slide. Some take-home messages from my perspective from all of that is that the planning is key. There's a lot of different partners involved in planning disaster response. And throughout that group of partners, you need to develop some kind of common understanding that within this debris, there are resources as well as risks to deal with. And that if you can use those resources wisely, you can have benefits and reduce costs of disaster response, such as value-added local products, sequestering the carbon in that debris, and also increasing the awareness of where's all that debris coming from. It's coming from forests, trees, and there's some benefits to holistic planning that recognizes that storms, hurricanes, and salvage can be part of a cycle of forest management. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carlos, and he's going to share some perspectives from his viewpoint on that situation. Next slide.
Well, good morning to all. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. In order to be expedition on this, I'll let you folks go over the bullets, and I'll try to make some comments and maybe focus on some macro issues, and that maybe all folks can point towards macroeconomic items that I'm sure will probably be of interest to Lawrence and to Brooks to discuss later on. But as Bill wrote on one of his slides, the volume of generated tons of salvageable material is over 4 million cubic yards. And so that means that if you use, say, the equivalent of 20 yards of trucks having a capacity of 20 yards per truck, you basically generated about 225,000 trips just to move this debris around. Regarding the third bullet, I was able to speak with large lumber yards owners, and based on the feedback that I got from them, they were not approached by sawmill operators who were able to get a hold of some of that material and see what possible market would be there. As Bill mentioned before, and related to the fourth bullet, there is no timber industry, so there are no businesses that have, say, for example, the large log loaders and the large log platforms that you have in the timber industry. So the ability to use, say, local firms, if they have had the equipment here, was certainly not possible. So we saw, and the federal government moved an incredible amount of resources from mainland US down here of companies that do this all the time. And then the last item that I would like to emphasize on the slide is when I talk about Puerto Rico not having disposal facilities, the EPA has kept the Puerto Rico government under the gun to do something about waste disposal facilities nowadays, and for the last few years, the local governments cannot deposit organic material into landfills. So there is a need to identify strategies in order to deal with this issue for future hurricanes. Next slide, please. Regarding the bullets that we have here, one of the things that Bill mentioned to me is that FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers are looking into mitigation strategies to reduce the expenses that the federal government invested in Puerto Rico regarding recovery efforts. So there are different things that could probably be a result out of this if a business industry would be involved, and I will try to mention some of those later on. The last bullet, when we talk about processing capacity of local sawyers, we have the benefit of a 2015 PhD thesis that captures some of this information. And based on the interviews that the Dr. Forero mentioned in her thesis, is that the sawmill productivity on the average per sawmill operator is about 12,000 board feet per year. For those of you who are into woodworking, wood milling, or if you're not, if you happen to go to a website, say of a manufacturer such as Wood-Mizer or of any of the others, for some of the small band mills, you will get that they have a throughput of about 320 board feet per hour, or 2,500 board feet per year. And if you multiply by 250 days per year, you get a production rate of 640,000 board feet per year. So if we, per sawmill operator, so if you do a brief calculation, the amount of board feet that this PhD thesis found out is that our sawmill operators have a productivity rate of about just under 2%. So that is something to note. Next slide, please. So here are some of the opportunities that we have, and I think maybe there should be some working groups that, if not established, should be established to look at some of these items. But there has to be a disaster response approach towards salvageable and non-salvageable trees as a result of the different issues that Bill has pointed out, and some of the issues that I pointed out, including the issue about landfills and the lack of available landfills for that. I believe that farmers and or businesses associated to farmers could play significant roles in disaster recovery, and that would reduce the recovery expenses. And at the same time, if you look at bullet number 4, they could receive monetary compensation to mitigate the economic losses that they suffered from these natural disasters. And I'm sure Bill could point to some of those later on. But if you recall from the earlier slides, we had a lot of feedback from Extension Service people and people from the Department of Agriculture, and farmers were really hit by the losses that they suffered. Next slide. For those of you who are involved in day-to-day disaster management issues, I think we have a lot of opportunities for developing resilience for the next events, and I summarize them into maybe 4 or 5 words, and that is, we have to plan better, we have to be prepared. So preparedness is another issue, and these are some things that I came up with in a brainstorming session of some of the things that we can do. We have to drill, we have to practice, and especially in recovering trees, there are many operations that are somewhat dangerous, and so the chainsawing operation and training is something that's very crucial. And here we have a picture of one of the instructors that came down from Forest Service. That's actually from Puerto Rico. He started back in 1989 after Hurricane Hugo, and he came down in 2019 as a resource for doing that. The other thing that we have to do is, once we drill, we have to execute what we planned. And after executing, we have to look at what happened. And if we need to revise the plan, then revise. And this becomes an iterative process. Next slide, please. So the future responses from all governments and businesses must be carefully evaluated, because we need to find out whether or not salvage trees, if they're converted to wood products, for example, are viable or not. And I did some quick numbers on the numbers that Bill shared. If you take, say, 4.5 million cubic yards and you convert that to board feet, you get something like 1.5 billion board feet. And as a result of a report that Bill was involved with, a few folks, I believe, from the Forest Products Lab, roughly about 15% of that mass could be available for, or could be converted to dimensional lumber. So that turns out to be 225 million board feet. If we compare that to the productivity measures that I mentioned before, and according to the throughput that the thesis revealed, it would take 1,700 years for her local sawmill operators to process all those trees into usable wood. If you use the manufacturer's productivity rates for small sawmills, this would take about 32 years. If you had industrial scale capacity sawmills, well, we would be talking about a different story, but we don't have hurricane events of this magnitude as we had with Maria. So you have to look at whether that makes sense or not. A probable best alternative in the future for helping the federal government and the local governments reduce recovery costs, maybe try to sell high valuable salvageable logs into the either US market or the international market. And maybe we could recover some of the expenses and put that back into the economy. And the final slide, next please, is our contact information. Dr. Gould has been the fellow who has been the and he is, I'm sorry?
You froze for a moment. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Carlos. Please continue.
Oh, okay. So his contact information is there, and my contact information is there as well. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. We have a few moments for questions directed to Dr. Gould and Mr. Lee before we open it up to broader questions for all of our panel members. So for our current team, was there any sort of community engagement in the process of salvaging the timber? Was the recovery process integrated into the community? And I guess, you know, along with that, you know, what was your engagement strategy to leverage this workforce to accomplish this?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I would say yes, there was a lot of community interest and engagement. One of the first meetings we had was about a month after the hurricane, when most of the island was still without power and very little cell phone coverage. And yet at the same time, 80 people showed up because we we made known that we wanted to see what was going on and with this wood, whether it was being burned, incinerated, put in the landfills or not. So among that group were farmers, sawmill owners, artisans, the community that's interested in wood product development. And so they were engaged right from the start with trying to see that these resources were used in a productive way. However, there was a very big disconnect between that community engagement and interest and the machinery to recover from a storm of this magnitude. And so that was one of the issues, was trying to make that connection between communities that had expertise and were trying to help with the machinery and the support from FEMA and Army Corps that was dealing with the vegetative debris. So that's a place for a lot of improvement. And I think it's something where you have to make steps and try to share some understanding among those community members and the disaster response community, which itself can be quite fragmented. So in this case, we had lots of activities that were governed by the municipality level, others that were governed by state level decisions, and others that were governed by federal level decisions. And not always a real good chain of communication at all those levels. And often the community members felt left out of the whole process.
Right. So our next question, really speaks to the potential of cascading events associated with an acute impact. So either of you gentlemen, can you speak to what replanting efforts may be underway to help stabilize the deforested areas, whether it's hill slope stabilization or just the stabilization of soils in general?
Mm-hmm.
We heard a lot about, landslides and flooding, post-disaster. It seems that without a concerted effort to stabilize and revegetate, it could be disaster in the making.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. And this might be of interest to this group. Right after the hurricane, there were lots of images of the defoliation, and an island that typically looks bright green with vegetation was brown. And so that captured a lot of people's attention, and the need for reforestation was recognized. And so there were resources available, and NGOs and federal funds to help with reforestation. The actual damage to the forests was a mix of downed and killed trees and broken branches and things, but the vegetation cover recovered fairly rapidly. And even though the forest structures had changed, there was pretty rapid regrowth of the canopy. So the need for reforestation maybe was not quite as great as what it appeared, right after the storm. But still, there was a big need for stabilizing slopes and a big opportunity for reforestation. One of the things that we noticed was a disconnect between the interest and support for reforestation and the knowledge and expertise about what to plant and where. And so we had a number of workshops that gathered different sectors of society to figure out what do you want from the reforestation, what are your objectives? And there are distinct differences in different sectors of society in terms of what they want from trees and forests. And so those are important things to build into a reforestation process. But one of the things we saw is that there was sort of a quick imperative to put resources into massive reforestation without a recognition that forest management, tree growth is a multi-decade process, and you really want to have a good idea what you expect in terms of benefits decades down the road before you start planting particular species or managing in certain ways. So I think one of the learning lessons was, again, you got to be ready and you got to be planning for reforestation after these kind of events, because when you try to do that planning after the fact, it becomes more difficult because the mechanisms for recovery are, the support is there right after an event, and you need to be well planned in order to make the best use of that kind of support. After a year, 2 years, another disaster happens somewhere else, and the NGOs and the support, and the interest starts to wane in terms of sort of long-term processes like reforestation. So it's important to kind of know that cycle and to be ready to make the best use of recovery resources. But that said, there are a lot of replanting efforts that are going on, lots of involvement of local and federal agencies and NGOs and private landowners. And that's been a good success story.
Terrific, thank you. We'll now open it up to the remainder of our panelists today. Again, just a reminder, if you have questions for any of our panelists, excuse me, please go ahead and utilize the Slido app that Sean has provided the information for. So our first question comes in, it says, what are the most critical considerations when thinking about how to make a business resilient? Is it savings, employee support? Is it the physical environment? How do you prioritize? What do you do first? And I guess, to capitalize on that question, what resources are available to help businesses identify that first step in resilience planning? Who would like to take that as everyone comes on? So, I'll look to our friends at the Chamber of Commerce Foundation first. If you could speak to how your toolkits perhaps are able to walk through small businesses that may be limited on time or staff. How do you help businesses identify that first step to becoming more resilient?
Yeah, I think, as we outlined there, we divide out the Resilience in a Box toolkit within the 6 critical areas within your business. So it's hard to pick one over the other, though I think definitely people is critical and should be a #1 priority when thinking about safety. Insurance is obviously key to make sure you have the financial backing as well. And then thinking about your supply chain, making sure that you have a continuity of operations should that business interruption occur would be where. And then I think the other thing that we also encourage businesses, if a disaster does take place, is to make sure that their data is backed up and that they document any damage to their business before they start to clean up, because that is going to be critical for not only insurance, but any other future financial opportunities that they might have to recoup some of that loss.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to Brooks is that we usually counsel small companies think about where they're most vulnerable. And so when you think about my sister-in-law's pizza place, like if 3 people don't show up to make pizza, it doesn't matter if everything's fine, they can't make anything. And then, Brooks and I, about 2 years ago, did a few in-person events for companies, and we were in St. John's, Florida. And one of the companies that spoke there was a local locksmithing company, right? And so they had, for them, as long as they can, collect like incoming addresses to go get locks fixed, and they can get that address to a guy in a truck, they don't really need anything else, right? The guy in the truck's got everything he needs. And so they had done everything. They backed everything up and they had cloud and everything like that. Unfortunately for them, and this is not saying a company shouldn't do this, unfortunately for them, the company in New York that sort of held the cloud servers, their servers crashed the same time the hurricane hit. completely independently and unrelated. So that, you know, obviously find out your vulnerabilities and plan for them to help pick which of the 6 to really sort of focus on the critical and the kit.
And Dan, the last thing that I'll add, I should have mentioned during the presentation, but beyond the Resilience in a Box Toolkit, we also have a help desk for small businesses that they can call into should they be impacted by any type of business interruption, and that's at 1-888-MY-BIZ-HELP, as well as we partner closely with a tool called Sabre that does an open close for business platform, and so a number of resources within sort of our suite of tools for small businesses.
Terrific, thank you. I want to turn now to Jennifer and Ellie. Building on a remark that you made and Brooks emphasized, or maybe the other way around. But Brooks, you mentioned that only 35% of small and mid-sized businesses have taken resilient steps, and Jennifer and Ellie, you spoke about you know, this paralysis in the ability to kind of muster the resources to take action. I was curious, you know, are there, you know, what are some of the variables associated with motivation or lack of motivation to take action? Is there a geographic, a socioeconomic, or a demographic variable that some of these practitioners and extension experts who we have in the room today, that they can begin to tailor their outreach and extension efforts to really get at you know, particularly vulnerable subsets of this small business universe?
I can start with that one, and then Jennifer, if you want to join in. So we haven't completed the demographic side or the sectoral side, but a couple of the things that we have seen, targeting those really new businesses, the businesses that often are vulnerable just because they've only been in business for a few years, they haven't built up the connections, the capital, all of these things that we often see create resilience are not there at the very beginning of a business. Also, the micro businesses. So we've been talking about small and medium-sized businesses, which is a very broad number and a very broad definition. It can go up to 200 employees, it can go up to 500 employees. But micro businesses, those businesses that are really under 10 people, they, in general, what we found across the surveys, from the very in-depth interviews to the shorter ones, is that when you only have a few employees, and like Lauren said, if they don't show up, they can't get there, the schools are closed, so they have to take care of their children. That's where there's quite a bit of vulnerability in terms of being able to adapt on the front end, as well as adapting and responding afterwards.
And I will just add, kind of leveraging some of our pre-pandemic work as well, and thinking about some of the responses from kind of our complex event work, that there are a few things that stand out. I think for those businesses that are very dependent on a storefront or a specific location, issues of renting versus owning that storefront and or your machinery can be very serious, because there's kind of a perverse incentive both ways, right? You don't want to improve someone else's property. You might not be allowed to improve someone else's property. So I think we all kind of know, and you know, with the Chamber Foundation, right, you're kind of disaster agnostic. And I don't typically love that phrase, but I think as we're seeing more and more different types of events that people need to plan for with really limited resources and budgets, kind of encouraging, if it's a choice between like the floodgate and holding some you know, resources that can be paid out in case it's not a flood that hits, if it's something that isn't as structurally damaging but stops your function, those are hard choices. Kind of, I'm not sure how to advise, but I think I could imagine for some businesses doing that risk calculus is really, really hard.
And one of the other things that we saw speaking of resources, was the use of business disruption insurance, which there are a lot of different clauses that go into that. How long do you have to be disrupted before you get a payout? How long can that payout be? How much is that? What does it really cover? And this goes across sectors, everything from agriculture to a small business storefront. And it's such a diverse, there are so many diverse options for that it can be very difficult to navigate, is what we've generally been hearing from groups who have chosen to buy it.
Terrific, thank you. So our next question from the audience. So what are some of the pre-disaster connections and plannings you see as the highest priorities to increase community resilience and in turn support business? So apart from the disaster recovery cycle, what do communities need to do to invest to retain and attract new business, keeping the businesses that they have, continued economic expansion? What are new businesses, industry leaders looking in terms of mitigated risk, where they want to hang a shingle? Anyone?
Yeah, sure. I'll start.
Brooks, why don't you go ahead, jump in?
Sure, I can. I'll turn to Lawrence. I think obviously we use our local chamber network. We encourage those introductions to take place. I think we find a lot of times in the local communities, the businesses don't talk to the elected officials don't talk to the community partners, and there needs to be that those channels of communications long before any type of disaster occurs. So I think that the more that those social systems are built up in advance of a disaster, that's what we encourage. I think most, there's all the different FEMA regions and the private sector liaisons within the different states. And as much as those businesses can make those connections with those authorities, as well as the NGOs that are going to be responding, the better that community is prepared to withstand that event.
Yeah, and that's thanks, Brooks. And Dan, I think one of the things that planners often forget, and this is true for everyone, regional planners, us, et cetera, and something that Eleanor sort of pointed out, is that there's a lot of differences between these small businesses. And when you think about where large businesses choose to go, right, when they want to set up shop somewhere and hang a shingle, they have, where are tax rates low, where is labor good, where, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Small businesses, there's limited research on this, but what is there suggests that small businesses generally start wherever that owner lives, right? They don't if I want to start a business, I don't think, Oklahoma City is really ready for a tornado. I'm going to go cut hair in Oklahoma City. I'm probably going to cut hair here in Silver Spring, Maryland, right? And so the flip side of that coin, however, is that most small business owners are ingratiated to that community already. So the connections that Brooks is bringing up don't have to start from whole cloth, right? I think I'd mentioned I grew up in Panama City. I went to high school with the guy who's the head of the chamber in Panama City, right? So if I were there, I could pretty easily, figure out, how to navigate these businesses, get in touch with elected officials in a way that I couldn't do if, a small business up and moved elsewhere. So I think these pre-existing conditions often are social in nature, which is useful, but unfortunately for the people on camera here, are difficult to quantify. So that would be sort of my input.
And just jumping in on that as well, one of the things that we've found in terms of asking people about how involved are you, what groups are you involved with as a business, that is something that also correlates with age. The longer the business has been around, the more involved they are in these organizations. And so some of these new businesses that are getting started don't necessarily have those same connections. They're not quite as involved. And then this kind of, it's a cycle that continues on that then creates vulnerabilities in terms of you're not involved, so you're not receiving the same level of support or the level of information. So just chiming in on that.
Dan, if I could chime in a little
Please.
bit, one of the most sort of compelling findings from all the interviews and focus groups we did was the sense of disconnection that people felt. And this came from individual farmers, business people, on up to regional agency leads. And part of that was the somewhat unique situation that everybody was affected. We were all in the disaster zone. But some of the successes of different sectors had a lot to do with their connectivity and whether there was a business organization. For example, the poultry sector and the dairy sector are fairly well organized. And so they had internal connections. They had connections with the Puerto Rico Department of Agriculture. And so there was some immediate aid that was funneled to those businesses that had that connection. The coffee industry is less organized, even though it's an important industry. It's less organized than those two. And we saw a lot of interest in coffee and the recovery of the coffee industry from Starbucks, from other folks. And some of that was sort of celebrity driven. And the relief efforts depended on which coffee farmer they knew. And so you would see, you know, a lot of publicity and relief go to particular farmers, and others are, you know, they're still trying to get some equipment to get into their property. And so there was a very big disconnect. And we're kind of interested in mapping out those connections because I think they're valuable. And also looking at the idea of social justice and how those connections might favor some sectors over others, just sort of preconditions or pre-connections. So I think it's a really important component of resiliency is having those connections at different levels.
Mhm.
Terrific. Well, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and this kind of goes back to I believe it was our friends at the chamber who brought this up, is the emergence of new small businesses in the COVID and probably post-COVID ideally era that we're in. Have y'all identified any particular challenges besides what's already been discussed about new business risk? Any particular challenges associated with the new businesses that have emerged during the pandemic?
Sure. So I'll start. Actually, someone who's an organizer might be able to share a link I just put in there. I didn't include it because it didn't really match what we were doing. But so sometimes business growth is tracked in a different way, people applying for an employee identification number. And so these are, you know, these could be employers, they could be people who are consultants who want to form their consultancy as a business. And if you look at, thank you. And if you just look partway down on that screen, and you don't need to see it to sort of visualize it, you'll see the growth and the amount of new EINs that are processed. And then if you look at quarter 3 of 2020, it's twice the annual rate. And so our expectation that a lot more businesses are being created is certainly the first step of that. A company creating an EIN is happening. And so where it's happening mostly deeper in that set, you can look at different industries, et cetera. Deeper in that set, you find that a lot of them are occurring in the NAICS code for professional and technical services, which is where a lot of one-person consultancies live, right? Because that's generally what they're offering. And so what we're sort of seeing now are and this is very early, what we're seeing now are these companies being, I hesitate to say companies with air quotes, but they are not employers, right? Are these companies being formed of individuals who are being pushed out of the labor market because they're lost their jobs? And the problem is they aren't really sure. Resiliency might not be important for them because they might not want to do this for very long, right? Why put forward the investment in making your business community stronger or your own self stronger if like you're going to take the next full-time job that gets dropped in your lap, right? And so the challenge we're seeing now is that there's a lot of people entering and that might be true for some small businesses anyway. Like I'm doing this as a stopgap to keep food on the table until a company hires me. And so I think what we're seeing now is a rapid increase in that occurring. It could be difficult to sort of get them to care or reach them or do anything moving forward. So that's the very, very early stages of what we're seeing in that growth.
Terrific. Thank you for that. We're at time. I'll turn it over to Amanda to close this out. Thank you all to all of our panelists. panelists, really great insight. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. Amanda?
Yeah, absolutely. I, again, just wanted to say thank you so much, guys. It's been an extremely interesting conversation this morning. We appreciate you giving your time and hope that folks who have been listening in have found the information useful as well. So the next session for the meeting will begin at 2 o'clock this afternoon on justice, inclusion, diversity, and equity in disaster management and adaptation. So we hope that you all can join us after your long lunch break, and then we'll close out the meeting at from 4 to 4:30 this afternoon. So many thanks again. We greatly appreciate it, and take care, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.